Welcome to Divine Intimacy Radio, a co-production of EWTN Radio and SpiritualDirection.com, where we provide you with a spiritual haven of rest and explore the riches of the wisdom of the saints and the path to union with God.
This is Dan and Jordan Burke. Welcome to Divine Intimacy Radio, your radio haven of rest.
Your hermitage of the heart.
Your monastery of the mind, where we lift our hearts and minds to heaven to draw upon the wisdom of the saints, the Catholic mystical tradition, so that we can navigate this crazy life we live.
Yeah, and I'm very appreciative that you wrote down my part of that intro, because even though I've been producing this show for a decade, I still cannot remember what the intro is.
Right. So Stephanie, of course, is in Costa Rica, and Jordan is now Stephanie, but they don't look anything alike, which is good, because we wouldn't be married if that was the case.
There's a lot of issues with what you're saying. We should probably just move on.
Okay, go ahead. So why don't we have a guest today who has some really powerful insights for you. Jordan, why don't you introduce Megan?
Megan Hjelmstad is a proud wife and hockey mom living in Denver, Colorado. She spent 15 years in the United States Army and currently serves the church as an author, speaker, and women's mentor. She loves to help others embrace their God-given identity, find hope in suffering, and discover practical tools for personal holiness. Her new book is called Offered Up, Discovering the Power and Purpose of Redemptive Suffering. You can also find her writing at Blessed Is She, SpiritualDirection.com, and her website, which I'm going to put up on the screen. And for those who are listening, it's meganhjelmstad.com.
Yeah, and just for those who are only listening, it's meganhjelmstad.com. So make sure you spell that right so you can find her, because I'm pretty sure you're going to want to find her after this interview. Welcome, Megan. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much, Dan and Jordan. It is an honor, a real privilege to be here.
Well, I'd like folks to get to know you a little bit before we talk about the insights that you have really helped offer to the church. By the way, just thank you for the great writing on SpiritualDirection.com. She has a great series out there on the Discernment of Spirits, 14 Rules. So anyway, talk to us a little bit about your story. You have suffered quite a bit physically, which I know is never just physically, just as a fellow person who's wrestled with disease. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Yeah, so it really didn't start out that way. I had a wonderful childhood. I grew up in the military archdiocese as a Catholic. My dad was in the Army, and so we spent time when I was young moving around a little bit. I lived in Italy. We lived in Vicenza, where I had the privilege when I was 4 years old of meeting Pope St. John Paul II, now saint. And my parents during that time, my mom especially, in a trip with the women of the installation there, the military installation, had a real reversion. They were kind of, going through the motions in their Catholic faith. And so when she had encountered Pope John Paul II, she really had this reversion of heart and brought us back several months later to see him. And it's one of my earliest memories. And it's interesting because it's also one of my earliest memories of pain when I was sitting on the petition in this grand not underground, but the building, and I'm blanking on the name of it right now, where the large audiences are held. And I just remember kind of wiggling in discomfort, and then seeing this grandpa-like man coming toward me, and he kissed me on the forehead, and he said, "Dion by and I have spent years just unpacking the goodness of that, but also the paradox of this wonderful encounter with a saint and the earliest cognizant memory I have of pain. And so from there, I had, I would say, a fairly idyllic childhood compared to most. I grew up, my dad was stationed at West Point after our time in Italy. So I grew up around this wonderful community of, at that time, very charismatic Catholics and retreats, cadets. I fell in love with West Point, and I said, I want to grow up and be a West Point cadet when I when I get big. And that dream never left. So even though we moved away, I followed through on that. By the time I got to high school, I was applying to all of the service academies. I had dreams of flying, and I ended up back at West Point. And during that time, I had begun to experience some very severe abdominal pain, but I was a competitive gymnast. I was a high school athlete. I was recruited to West Point for collegiate diving, swimming and diving. And so this really didn't fit into my plan. And I had heard maybe the term authored up, but it didn't really resonate with me. It sounded kind of like the military mentality that I was steeped in, which was suck it up, drive on, minimize your suffering. It's nothing that you need to acknowledge. Just keep your eye on the prize and push it aside or escape it. And don't talk about it because we don't want to hear about it. And so that was really my approach to suffering. And that pain just got worse and worse and worse. And by the time I met my wonderful husband at West Point, by the time we graduated, 6 months later, we got married, I realized that I was dealing with severe endometriosis and later found out after 4 surgeries, adenomyosis. So we were blessed with 2 kids right off the bat. And then I went through 2 really tragic pregnancy losses, an ectopic pregnancy for which I had to have emergency surgery. And then we were told, you probably can't have more kids. And so I just kind of sent up this half-hearted sort of prayer to our family patron, St. Jude, who had, by the way, helped pray my husband Peter into the church when we were in college. And I said, it'd be really nice to raise at least 1 more baby. And lo and behold, our youngest was then conceived, due, and born on St. Jude's feast day. And so that was really the first profound sign that I had kind of received in this truth that God isn't merely, just allowing this suffering or causing this suffering even and leaving me to fend for myself, but that he truly cares about the details in it and even grieves with me in that suffering. And so I kind of had this softening of heart with that, for us, great miracle in our family. And from there, the suffering got worse. I ended up I started to react to one food after another that I had eaten for years and years and years. And so I had to try and remove foods from my diet to the point where I was only able to eat about 10 foods total, salt and pepper included. And that's still the case today. And I also started having reactions, very tragically, to the Eucharist, to low gluten hosts, and even the wine used for consecration. So I have long periods of having to abstain or fast from our Eucharistic Lord, which is not just painful mentally, emotionally, physically, but so painful spiritually too, and something that I've had to wrestle with and work through with our Lord. So from there, I started about 5 years ago dealing with some very severe pain in my hands and feet as well. And after lots of testing and trying to figure out what was going on and going to lots of different specialists, I found out that I have a disease called ankylosing spondylitis, or as my husband calls it, my ankylosaurus dinosaur disease that causes my joints, and it's especially spine for most people, to kind of degenerate. And so most mornings when I get up, I have trouble walking, and I had to give up most of the things that I love doing. So after 5 years on active duty, and then 15 years total after active duty, 10 years in the Army Reserve, I had to kind of retire early and give up a lot of things that I love doing here in Colorado, like hiking mountains and skiing. And so it's really been this tug of war almost between begging the Lord for healing, and when that healing doesn't happen, trying to reconcile, why are you allowing this? And knowing that he's good, but trying to find how that actually can coincide with my circumstances and find that truth of God's goodness in this pain and in this suffering, and grieve all of these losses, and then receive what the Lord is asking of me in this suffering, which is actually a deeper union with him.
I've heard parts of your story, and I'm wishing this was a 2 hour long conversation because I think there's so much wisdom to be gained. But of course, Megan has written a book that captures a lot of the, just the real insights from what it means to live with suffering. It's called Offer It Up, Discovering the Power and Purpose of Redemptive Suffering. It's interesting, I grew up in the suck it up thing too. The hard part is when you're hospitalized. It's one thing when you're healthy, and one of my earliest memories of my dad was looking up at him, and he was working, and he had blood running down his arm. And I said, Dad, and he's like, what? And then I pointed at his arm, and he goes, oh, and he goes back to work. So that's the kind of context I grew up in. But it doesn't really work all that well when you're constantly in the hospital, and when you're constantly, when you're dealing with life-threatening illness. I do think there's some good in that disposition, because for me, if I didn't play injured, I'd never play. And it gave me a kind of resilience, but it also can lead to kind of a deep darkness where it's just like you're going, okay, what's next? Okay, yeah, I survived this one, but what's next? So I think, so I don't know, is there any, we only have 1 minute 20 left before or so the break, but do you find anything was helpful about that suck it up mentality?
I mean, I think in some ways you talked about the resilience. So being able to understand that suffering isn't the end all be all, but also it leads to the self-sufficiency of suffering. And so there's always that mean between the two extremes, right? Jesus didn't conflate his suffering, but he never minimized it either.
Yeah, the other thing you haven't done, I don't hear, and I did this for a while, is when you suffer as much as you have, and many people have, suffering can become your identity. Like, oh, hi, Megan, how are you? Oh, well. And I mean, if you ask me that on any given day, you won't hear it, but I could give you a list, right? Oh, well, I can't eat, and I can't, I can't do this. But that's not our identity. And I think what you've discovered in this suffering is how to live out your identity, and the gift that the unique gift that the Lord's given you, and to suffer, but also to play a part in his salvation of the world. So when we get back from the break, we're going to talk about a little bit more of that side of the coin, if you will. So Megan Hjelmstad, Hjelmstad, I'm sorry, I'm going to mess your name up 75 times. But folks will remember it more that way.
That's true. Yeah.
Hjelmstad, Hjelmstad, and you can find her more information about her at meganhjelmstad.com. We'll be right back.
Hello, friends. Simone Riscala here, and I want to invite you to the Ecce Homo Lent Retreat 2025. The theme is on the sorrowful mysteries of Our Lady, and this is a fantastic opportunity to look at your own sorrowful mysteries, to look at those wounds, maybe those mother wounds that prevent you from deeper intimacy into the heart of God. We also have the Passionist sisters who are joining us for live meditations. We'll be examining the mother wound, and we'll be taking Q&A. So don't miss out on this awesome retreat with some amazing speakers during this Jubilee of Hope. So I invite you to register, join us live, and I look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome back to Divine Intimacy Radio. We're talking to Megan Hjelmstad about her wisdom, from her own. This is not a book written out of sort of abstract academic ideas. This is a book that's emerged, the wisdom that Megan shares, it's emerged out of her deep suffering and her own wrestling with, who am I in this? Who am I as a military person, as a mom, as a wife? Who am I with God? What is this whole thing about? And so we're grateful to have her. And hopefully you really got to pick up her book, Offer It Up. I don't know if there's some good books out there on suffering, but I think Megan's perspective is so balanced, but yet not in any way boring. Or when we say balance, I think of sleepy. It's not like that. It's just clear and deep and powerful. I mean, Jordan, you're reading it now.
I'm going through it. Yeah, no, I really enjoy it. I was going to say early on, this is one of the few books where the first chapter, or maybe the introduction, I think most of us, when we come to an introduction, we're like, okay, we'll kind of skim it.
Yeah.
This is the first one I read that hooked me in. I was like, all right, no, I'm reading this whole thing. We're going in. It was very, very good. So I'm enjoying it a lot. And I haven't gone through nearly the amount of suffering physically as both of y'all. Mine's a different kind of suffering, but I don't know. I really appreciate when this kind of text comes up and these conversations happen, because I think that there's just such a lack of understanding of the beauty of what God is giving us within suffering. And that's exactly what Megan's book is revealing to people in a way that's really easy to understand.
Good.
So, and
Good.
I wanted one more thing before we get in, because I don't
Yeah.
think we're going to have a chance to say it. We got a chance to hang out at one of our summits years ago. I remember sitting on the porch of the Bethlehem house with Megan and Father John Burns. And just as a credit to you, I had no clue that you had any of this going on, in your life at all. No indication whatsoever. And so it's really interesting having that perspective, having spent, it was a little bit of time that we spent together, and then now reading the story and thinking, wow, I had no idea that all this was.
You know what? Let's take that, Megan. How is it that we can know joy in the midst of suffering and serve others in the midst of suffering? How did you come about that ability? Whether it be perspective, prayer, what insights? What do you give us some of your thoughts?
The short answer is only Jesus.
Yeah.
Quite obviously, but it has not been an easy road. And you were saying before the break, it's easy to make suffering your identity. And I kind of wrote in a chapter about comparison and suffering, and the two ends of either pushing through, like we talked about earlier, or victimizing your suffering or yourself in suffering, and saying this is all happening to me and it's not fair, and complaining. And I could have a trophy room for all of the ways that I have claimed that victimization, unfortunately, in the past, and how I'm still tempted to. So I'm praise God that you didn't get any of that, but my family has heard me complain plenty, and it really is. It's a battle. It's a continual battle to allow the Lord into our suffering. And I think the easiest way to find that joy is by inviting Jesus in every single moment. And the practical ways that I've learned to do that have been the most helpful, because we are fallen human beings, and it's so easy to turn back on ourselves over and over. And suffering is one of the enemy's favorite tools to try and get us to do that, and to think that God doesn't care, or separate us from the Lord or from hope and our desires and expectations, right? And so to be able to really unite that suffering to the Lord, and it's as simple as saying, Lord, I give this to you, or I offer this to you, or I invite you into it, which is one of my favorites, because sometimes, when you can't escape it, it feels really hopeless. Kind of you're stuck in the pit, but inviting Jesus into that pit with you makes you remember that you're not alone, and allows him to take it and to use it for good, and to bring you into this perspective of hope of that this is passing, but in eternity, there will be a lasting victory that is far greater and far more fruitful than what you're going through now.
That's helpful. I'll give you a minute to think about this question, and then I'll ask you two. And one is, can you give a specific example of a recent event? Because I think you're very practical in what you're saying, but it's super helpful for people to hear, as close to the ground as we can get. So if you want to think through that. The other thing I wanted to talk about, I know Jordan would be, I don't think he's run across this yet in the book, or you might have, but Megan is a fan of uniformity with God's will.
I'm not surprised. I can tell.
Yeah.
We're a very select club. You can tell.
Right. My latest book, I don't know, I'm writing so many, but a recent book, and one of my favorites is called Finding Peace in the Storm, which is spiritual reflections on uniformity with God's will. What is that, and how has it helped you to face your suffering?
Yeah, I would love to answer with a story that actually comes from Uniformity with God's Will by St. Alphonsus Liguori, which is that St. Alphonsus tells this story of a man who went to the tomb of, he says, St. Thomas of Canterbury, St. Thomas Becket, that he went to this tomb and prayed for a cure for his illness. And he says that he came away from St. Thomas's tomb cured, and he returned home, and he had this good, right? This earthly good, and even in some ways a spiritual good of health that seemed so valuable. But then he thought to himself, suppose I were to have prayed for what was best for my eternal salvation instead. And so he decided to return to St. Thomas's tomb and ask the saint to intercede for him for that, for what was best for his eternal salvation. And his illness returned. And he was content, knowing that this illness that God was allowing was actually more medicinal for him in the long run than health in this life, this short pilgrimage on earth. And so I think we, in terms of uniformity with God's will and receiving God's will, we are so hyper focused on the short term, and it's getting worse and worse with, 2-day overnight now deliveries from Amazon and instant gratification. I mean, our attention spans are so short that we have lost the ability to wait on anything, especially God and the good that he's bringing out of suffering. And he always brings good out of suffering when we allow him. But when we are so hyper focused on being able to see that good here and now and have it proven to us, it's a deficiency of our sight. It's a disorder of our sight. And so the Lord continues to prioritize our souls, even when we are really focused in a disordered way on our bodies for our temporal pleasure and contentment.
So that reminds me, this is actually the perfect segue, because I mentioned before we started, I really wanted to talk about the story that you have in your book about your dog.
Yes.
And I feel like that's probably the perfect analogy to follow up what you just said. Do you mind sharing that with us?
Not at all. So I have wrestled with every single one of these questions. So it's easy to say these things, but in order to live them, it has taken many years and a lot of experience and wrestling that I still go through. And so one time I was really trying to understand why God would allow this suffering. Like, I know there's a greater good, but Lord, if you just gave me a little more perspective on why, I think I could handle it. And at that point, we had happened to get a puppy, a Great Pyrenees puppy. Great Pyrenees are an extra large breed.
Yeah.
And so he's beautiful, wonderful, but he was 4 months old, and I had just gone through a really extensive surgery. And he happened to get into a poison rat trap in the basement. So my husband got him to the vet, got his stomach pumped, and then they had to give him some vitamin K to prevent internal bleeding, and told us that he needed to be prevented from any running or jumping for a month in order to be in the clear. And I would wrap my head around this 80-pound, like 3-foot ball of energy, not running or jumping. And so we had a crate still at that time, and I would keep him in the crate, and then I would try to put him on the leash to take him outside. And he became a master of deception and trying to escape. And he would run downstairs and literally body slam himself against the back door, wanting to go outside. And I found myself one day just in utter exasperation saying, his name is Otto, saying, Otto, this is for your good. You're just going to hurt yourself worse. In that moment was a moment of clarity for me spiritually, that I can try to explain all I want to Otto, that this seeming worst suffering that he's ever been through in his little puppy life is for his good, that he's never going to understand it. He's not going to understand why I'm not letting him go outside and run around and play and jump, why he has to stay contained. I can explain it over and over, but the disparity between his mind and mine as a human is too great. And I realized, again, in that moment, that the disparity between our mind and God's is even greater. And he says it, your understanding, my ways are higher than your ways. And so our understanding compared to God's understanding, it cannot comprehend sometimes. And so the Lord has to play that role for us as a good father. He has to allow what is best for us in eternity, even when we can't simply grasp it.
Well said. And unfortunately, we're out of time. I will say, though, your book does bring us a great deal across that chasm of dealing with the sovereign love and all-knowingness of God, and what we need for our salvation, which is of his ultimate concern, that we are in union with him, and then what is necessary to bring about that union to heal our brokenness. You guys got to get Megan Hjelmstad's book, Hjelmstad book. I told you I'd say it wrong over and over, but it's MEGANHJELMSTAD.com. And the book is entitled Offer It Up, Discovering the Power and Purpose of Redemptive Suffering, by Emmaus Road Publishing. Great publisher, by the way. You will be changed by it, I have no doubt, especially if you've gone through a lot of suffering. And if you know someone who's going through a lot, this will be a great help to them. Megan, thank you so much for all your good work with Blessed Is She and with spiritualdirection.com and helping the world understand how to find the Lord.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Jordan.
Okay, go ahead.
Until next time, may the God of peace make you perfect in holiness. May he preserve you whole in entire spirit, soul, and body, irreproachable at the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ.
Amen.
Learn more about the interior life. Visit spiritualdirection.com. Divine Intimacy Radio is a co-production of EWTN Radio and spiritualdirection.com and heard worldwide on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.